There are fighters the UFC builds entire eras around, and then there are fighters the UFC calls when everything is about to fall apart. Mark Hunt was never the face of the company, never the future, never the safe investment. He was something far more dangerous. The man the system relied on when the risk was highest and the margin for error was gone. Whenever a card needed saving, whenever a star disappeared, whenever the UFC needed someone who wouldn't say no, Mark Hunt was the call. Short notice, unfavorable matchups, opponents with size, youth, or leverage advantages. Hunt wasn't chosen because he was protected, he was chosen because he wasn't. For years, fans saw Mark Hunt as a warrior, a throwback, a human highlight reel who walked forward no matter the cost. But that image hides a much colder truth. In the UFC, toughness isn't rewarded, reliability is. And reliability doesn't mean winning belts or selling pay-per-views. It means doing the job without creating problems. It means absorbing risk so the system doesn't have to. Mark Hunt did that better than almost anyone until the moment he stopped accepting his role. This isn't a story about knockouts, or heart, or resilience. It's a story about how the UFC manages danger, about why some fighters are insulated, while others are exposed, about how a man can be essential to the system and still be disposable. Because Mark Hunt wasn't buried when he started losing. He wasn't buried because of age, or decline, or controversy. He was buried when he stopped being useful in the way the UFC needed him to be. To understand what really happened to Mark Hunt, you have to stop looking at the cage and start looking at the structure around it. The contracts, the incentives, the silent rules that decide who gets protected and who gets sent forward when something has to break. This video isn't about whether Mark Hunt was right or wrong. It's about why, in a system built on control, independence is the one thing that can't be tolerated. In the UFC, there is a clear difference between fighters who are developed and fighters who are deployed. One group is protected, paced, and positioned for long-term value. The other is used when something has already gone wrong. Mark Hunt belonged to the second category. He was not part of a growth plan. He was part of a contingency plan. Look closely at when Hunt was booked into major fights, and a pattern emerges. Short notice opportunities, replacement roles, events that needed credibility more than they needed a winner. The UFC didn't rely on Hunt to carry divisions forward, they relied on him to stabilize chaos. That distinction matters, because stability is only valuable when it absorbs risk away from the organization itself. When a star drops out, when negotiations collapse, when a card suddenly looks weak, the system doesn't need perfection. It needs someone who will show up and make the event feel legitimate. Hunt fit that role precisely because he didn't demand leverage. He didn't build negotiating power through media pressure or fan mobilization. He didn't threaten to walk unless conditions changed. He accepted fights that others would hesitate to touch, not because he was reckless, but because he believed toughness still meant something inside the sport. The system rewarded that belief not with protection, but with opportunity. And opportunity without protection is simply controlled exposure. This is where many fans misunderstand how risk is distributed in the UFC. The promotion does not spread danger evenly, it concentrates it. Fighters with negotiating power are insulated from it. Fighters without leverage are placed in its path. Mark Hunt wasn't reckless, he was accessible, he was available. And availability, in a tightly scheduled entertainment machine, is more valuable than dominance. Every time Hunt accepted a fight under unfavorable conditions, the system learned something important. He could be relied on without creating instability. He wouldn't derail negotiations. He wouldn't hold events hostage. He wouldn't turn business problems into public crises. That reliability made him indispensable, but only in the narrowest sense. He was indispensable as a solution, not as an asset. And solutions are replaced the moment they stop functioning quietly. The UFC doesn't publicly categorize fighters this way, but internally, the distinction is obvious. Some fighters are investments, others are insurance policies. Insurance only matters when disaster is possible. Once the risk passes, the policy is no longer needed. Mark Hunt existed in that space for years, stepping forward when outcomes were uncertain and the upside belonged elsewhere. From the outside, it looked like respect. From the inside, it was utility. Hunt's reputation as a warrior wasn't something the UFC created, but it was something the UFC benefited from. That reputation allowed the promotion to frame dangerous matchups as courage instead of exposure. It shifted responsibility away from the structure and onto the individual. If things went well, the event was saved. If things went poorly, the narrative was already written. He chose the fight. That framing is critical. In a system built on contracts and compliance, choice becomes the most effective shield. As long as a fighter agrees, the organization carries no visible responsibility for the outcome. Mark Hunt agreed again and again because he believed the fight itself was the point. But the UFC doesn't run on belief. It runs on risk management. And risk management demands that someone else absorbs the danger first. This is why Hunt was never positioned as a future. Futures require protection. They require margins. They require room for error. Hunt was given none of those things because he wasn't meant to last. He was meant to function. And he did, until functioning quietly was no longer enough. Protection in the UFC is often misunderstood. Fans assume it's about popularity, winning streaks, or respect earned inside the cage. In reality, protection is about leverage. It's about how much damage a fighter can cause outside the cage if something goes wrong. Mark Hunt never had that kind of leverage, and more importantly, he never tried to build it. The UFC doesn't protect fighters because they're tough. Toughness is expected. What the organization protects are variables that can disrupt the business. Fighters who can turn public opinion. Fighters who can stall negotiations. Fighters whose absence creates financial consequences. Mark Hunt, despite his reputation and longevity, never positioned himself as any of those things. He showed up. He fought. He took what was offered. And in a system built on control, that behavior is interpreted as consent, not courage. This is where the idea of fairness collapses. The UFC doesn't operate on moral balance, it operates on incentives. Fighters who generate leverage are buffered from risk because losing them creates instability. Fighters who don't are placed where the system needs pressure absorbed. Hunt existed in that second category for most of his UFC run. Not because he wasn't respected, but because respect doesn't equal bargaining power. Look at how protection actually manifests. It's not announced, it's structural. It shows up in timing, opponent selection, recovery windows, and contractual flexibility. Protected fighters are rarely asked to fix emergencies. They are rarely placed into situations where the downside outweighs the upside. Hunt was routinely placed exactly there, not because the UFC wanted him to fail, but because his failure wouldn't threaten the system. This is the cold reality of risk allocation. The UFC cannot afford to expose every valuable asset equally. Someone has to take the dangerous assignments. Someone has to fight when circumstances are imperfect. Someone has to accept uncertainty so the promotion can maintain control. Mark Hunt filled that role consistently, publicly, and without resistance. What made this arrangement sustainable for so long was Hunt's mindset. He believed fighting itself was the currency. He believed showing up mattered. He believed that merit would eventually be rewarded. But merit is not the same thing as leverage. And in a closed system, leverage is the only protection that exists. The UFC doesn't punish fighters for lacking leverage. It simply doesn't compensate for it. This is why Hunt's career often appeared paradoxical. He was trusted, yet never insulated. Valued, yet rarely prioritized. Celebrated, yet consistently exposed. Those contradictions aren't accidents, they're signals. They show where a fighter sits in the hierarchy of risk. Hunt wasn't on the top or the bottom. He was in the middle, where damage is most easily absorbed and least likely to create backlash. The most important thing to understand is this. The UFC didn't need to actively decide not to protect Mark Hunt. Protection is not something that's removed. It's something that's granted. And Hunt never triggered the conditions that make protection necessary. He didn't threaten the brand. He didn't mobilize fans against decisions. He didn't turn internal disagreements into external pressure. Without those forces, the system had no reason to adjust around him. That's why Hunt's exposure continued, even as his value increased. He became more useful, not more powerful. And usefulness without power is a trap. It convinces fighters they're indispensable, when in reality, they're interchangeable. The moment Hunt stopped accepting that equation, the moment usefulness turned into resistance, the system responded exactly as it was designed to. To understand what happened next, you have to strip emotion out of the conversation. The Brock Lesnar fight was not personal. It wasn't about Mark Hunt as an individual, and it wasn't about fairness. It was about timing, money, and containment of risk, the three forces that actually drive decisions at the highest level of the UFC. UFC 200 was not just another event. It was supposed to be a milestone, a statement card, a showcase of dominance for the promotion itself. When multiple high-profile fights fell apart, the UFC faced a problem bigger than any single athlete. The event still had to work. The brand still had to look untouchable, and the solution had to arrive fast. That's where Brock Lesnar entered the picture. Brock wasn't just a fighter, he was a financial stabilizer. His presence guaranteed attention, coverage, and legitimacy. But Brock came with constraints, short notice, special conditions, unusual exemptions. The system accepted those constraints because the upside dwarfed the risk for the organization. What the system needed next was not a perfect opponent, it needed a credible one. Someone ranked high enough to make the fight real. Someone dangerous enough to prevent embarrassment. Someone willing to accept the conditions without turning the negotiation into a public standoff. That profile narrowed the options dramatically, and it led directly to Mark Hunt. This is where the framing matters. The UFC didn't need Mark Hunt to win. They needed him to make the fight viable. They needed him to step into uncertainty so the organization wouldn't have to. From a system perspective, this wasn't exploitation, it was allocation. Risk was placed where it would create the least institutional damage if things went wrong. When fans argue about whether the fight should have happened, they often focus on the aftermath. But the real decision happened earlier. It happened when the UFC evaluated who could absorb the downside. Brock had leverage. He always did. His value existed outside the cage. Mark Hunt's value existed only inside it. That imbalance decided everything before the fight ever began. This doesn't require conspiracy to function. Systems don't need malicious intent to produce unequal outcomes. They only need incentives. The UFC's incentive was to protect a landmark event and preserve momentum. Mark Hunt's incentive was to fight. Those incentives collided, and the system sided with the one that protected itself. Once the fight was made, responsibility shifted almost entirely onto the fighter. Consent became the shield. The narrative became simple. Hunt agreed. But agreement inside a closed system is not the same as choice in an open one. When refusing means disappearing, consent carries a very different weight. This is why the Brock Lesnar fight became a turning point. Not because of what happened inside the cage, but because of what it revealed afterward. It exposed how risk is handled when stakes are high. It showed which assets are protected and which are positioned as buffers. And most importantly, it showed Mark Hunt exactly where he stood. Not as a partner, not as a priority, but as a mechanism the system was willing to use to protect itself. Up to that point, Hunt had accepted the role quietly. He had absorbed the risk without challenging the structure behind it. But after this fight, something changed. The equation was no longer just physical, it became institutional. And once a fighter stops fighting opponents and starts questioning the system itself, the outcome is almost always the same. Up until this moment, everything about Mark Hunt's relationship with the UFC could still be explained as business as usual. Hard fights, unequal leverage, structural exposure. None of that was new. What changed everything was not a loss, not age, and not performance inside the cage. What changed everything was the decision to challenge the system publicly and legally. When Hunt filed his lawsuit, the UFC no longer saw him as a fighter navigating a dispute. They saw him as something far more dangerous, a precedent. The legal action wasn't threatening because of its chances of success. It was threatening because of what it represented. If a fighter could accuse the promotion of knowingly exposing him to risk and survive inside the system afterward, it would alter the balance of power permanently. That was never going to be allowed. This is where many observers misunderstand the reaction that followed. The UFC didn't need to retaliate openly. It didn't need to ban, blacklist, or publicly condemn him. Systems rarely do. They respond by withdrawing support, narrowing options, and letting friction do the work quietly. From that point forward, Hunt wasn't just a difficult employee. He was a variable that couldn't be controlled. Once a fighter becomes uncontrollable, everything around him changes. Medical scrutiny intensifies. Opportunities become conditional. Decisions that once felt routine now come with delays and complications. None of this needs to be coordinated to be effective. The structure itself applies pressure, and pressure doesn't need intent, only alignment. The public framing shifted quickly. Concerns about health and safety began to dominate the conversation. Statements were made about protecting fighters from themselves. On the surface, this looked responsible. Inside the system, it served a second function. It reframed the conflict. Instead of a dispute about fairness or accountability, the narrative became about judgment and reliability. The fighter wasn't being silenced, he was being managed. This reframing is one of the most powerful tools any institution has. Once a critic is positioned as unstable or unreliable, the system no longer has to engage with the substance of the criticism. It only has to question the source. And for a fighter whose leverage already depended entirely on participation, that shift is devastating. From this point on, Hunt's usefulness collapsed. Not because he couldn't fight, but because he couldn't be trusted to absorb risk quietly anymore. The system doesn't punish defiance with force. It punishes it with isolation. Opportunities shrink, support evaporates, and the individual is left to carry the consequences alone while the machine continues uninterrupted. What's crucial here is that the UFC didn't need to win the legal battle in court to win it structurally. The mere existence of the lawsuit changed the terms of Hunt's career. It turned every interaction into a liability calculation. And in a system that prioritizes control above all else, liabilities are always minimized. By choosing to challenge the UFC openly, Hunt crossed an invisible line. Not a moral one, a functional one. He moved from being a solution the system could deploy to a problem the system needed to neutralize. And once that transition happens, there is no path back. The rules don't bend, they simply close. Once Mark Hunt crossed into open resistance, the outcome was no longer uncertain. At that point, the system didn't need to defeat him publicly. It only needed to outlast him. That's how institutions win conflicts with individuals, not by force, but by endurance. The UFC never had to prove that Hunt was wrong. It never had to convince the public that every decision had been perfect. All it had to do was continue operating as if nothing fundamental had changed. Cards kept moving. New fighters filled old slots. Narratives shifted. The machine absorbed the shock and moved forward. Hunt, on the other hand, had nowhere to redirect the impact. This imbalance is built into the structure. Fighters age. Promotions don't. Fighters carry physical damage, financial pressure, and limited windows. Institutions carry none of that. Time itself favors the system. Every month that passes reduces a fighter's leverage and increases the cost of resistance. Even when a fighter believes he's fighting for principle, the system only sees duration. By the end of Hunt's UFC run, the pattern was unmistakable. Fewer opportunities, less patience, no structural effort to reintegrate him as a long-term asset. The system didn't need to erase his legacy, it simply allowed it to expire. Fans often interpret this as bitterness or decline. In reality, it's procedural. Once a fighter is no longer useful in the right way, the system reallocates resources elsewhere. The legal outcome didn't need to vindicate the UFC completely to serve its purpose. What mattered was the signal it sent. Challenging the structure carries consequences that extend far beyond a single case. Not because of punishment, but because of visibility. Every other fighter watching learned the same lesson. Resistance is expensive, and it's paid for alone. This is the final irony of Mark Hunt's story. He wasn't destroyed because he was weak. He wasn't discarded because he failed. He was sidelined because he disrupted the balance the UFC depends on to function. In a system where control is the highest value, independence is not a virtue, it's a threat. Mark Hunt believed fighting was about courage and accountability. The UFC operates on predictability and containment. Those two worldviews can coexist only as long as they don't collide. Once they do, The system doesn't have to explain itself. It only has to keep going. And it does. Mark Hunt's story isn't a tragedy, and it isn't a warning about toughness or heart. It's a case study in how modern combat sports actually work. The UFC doesn't need fighters to agree with it. It needs them to function within it. As long as Hunt absorbed risk quietly, the system kept calling his name. The moment he challenged the structure instead of the opponent, the equation changed. This is the part fans rarely want to confront. The UFC doesn't erase people out of spite. It doesn't have to. It simply reallocates attention, opportunity, and protection until resistance becomes unsustainable. The machine keeps moving because it was never built around any one fighter. Mark Hunt fought the hardest battles of his career outside the cage, and that's precisely why he lost them. Not because he was wrong, but because systems don't reward independence. They survive by outlasting it.